Is it possible to define intelligence?
I know what intelligence is when I see it.
That's very vague.
Isn't that a silly question? Have we not always known what intelligence is?
The concept of intelligence, as we understand it today, has only been around for about 150 years.
Were all people stupid before that?
No, people just use different terms like understanding, cleverness, reason, wisdom, and so on. Which term was used depended on the situation.
That reassures me, that not everyone used to be a moron.
Actually, the term moron wasn't introduced until around 1900.
Ah, so morons are quite a new phenomenon.
People were looking for a term to describe the opposite of intelligence. For intelligence, they came up with an explanation that they thought was scientific.
How did they do that?
To do this, you need at least one measurement. First, you must be able to define intelligence. In the beginning, people measured skulls in order to draw conclusions about a person's intelligence. This practice is called phrenology. The Dutch Eugène Dubois believed that brain size was decisive for intelligence. To gather sufficient data, he weighed the brains of 3,690 animals. He also compared body weight to brain size.
And was he able to measure intelligence that way?
That's not really possible because brain size and intelligence is mostly a correlation, but there are still studies trying to identify a link between brain growth and intelligence. According to this perspective, nutrition positively influences the brain. But methods that measure a person's performance rather than the size of their skull have been more successful. One of the first to develop such methods was Francis Galton. He founded a laboratory where people tested their abilities, how well they could distinguish between objects of different weights, how well they could detect smells, and how well they could taste the salt content in water. Galton believed that the sensitivity of the senses was crucial to intelligence.
That's strange. Why did he do that in the first place?
Galton was an eugenicist who wanted only intelligent people to reproduce. To do that, of course, he first had to be able to determine who was actually intelligent.
But nowadays, when we're trying to figure out how smart someone is, we don't test their senses.
We use IQ tests. They were introduced in 1904 by the French psychologist Alfred Binet. But he wasn't interested in finding out whether someone was intelligent. His tests had a different purpose. At the time, the French Ministry of Education was concerned that children with intellectual disabilities would be unable to keep up with the standard curriculum in schools. Binet developed a test to evaluate children's mental abilities and identify those with weaknesses. They were then sent to special schools. Binet's test was the first IQ test as we understand it today.
Actually, it was a test designed to detect stupidity.
Around the same time, the English psychologist Charles Spearman developed a theory of intelligence. He was convinced that people who perform well on one test would also perform well on other tests. He considered this proof that intelligence is a trait of a person. He called this trait the G factor.
So, what exactly is the G factor?
For Spearman, it is a value that can be determined statistically. He used methods developed by Francis Galton. Spearman rejected the idea that there are different definitions of intelligence and wanted to unify them all through the G factor. He distinguished between two different factors, general intelligence and specific intelligence. These two factors are not fundamentally different and they can be combined mathematically.
But that's not a justification yet.
To justify this approach, he introduced the concept of mental energy. He considered it a constant, so he could argue that intelligence, which is based on mental energy, is also a constant.
To be honest, I'm still a bit confused about what mental energy actually is.
You are not the only one. Probably no one knows exactly. But Spearman's concept of the G factor continues to dominate the discussion of intelligence to this day. The key point to remember is that intelligence is considered a consistent personal trait as opposed to an attribute of a specific action.
What's the difference?
If intelligence is a characteristic of an action, then even people who are usually intelligent can act foolishly, and conversely, people who are usually foolish can act intelligently. But if intelligence is a characteristic of a person, like how tall they are, then it is fixed. so the person would therefore always have to be intelligent. This is how people can be classified.
But how are you supposed to classify them? It's impossible to measure mental energy.
Essentially, the entire argument is based on the intelligence test.
The test developed by Binet to determine who is an idiot?
They rely on various similar tests. One of the early tests is the SAT, a test to get into college. But the IQ test introduced by David Wechsler is the most widely used. Studies have shown that students with higher IQs are on average more successful later in life than those with lower IQs.
So the test works.
Well, the same can be said about students who get better grades. On average, they will also be more successful later on, and students with the better grades tend to score higher on IQ tests.
That's not surprising.
The real question is what an IQ test actually measures. Just because the test is called an intelligence test doesn't prove that it actually measures something like intelligence.
What else is it supposed to measure?
Let's take a look at how an IQ test is structured. It mainly asks questions about math, logic, and sometimes also about general knowledge. For example, the meaning of terms.
Anyone who can answer these questions correctly should be intelligent.
But the question is why. Someone can be trained to do that. A student who was always good at math will have an easier time than a student who struggled. Someone who attended a school with strong math instruction has an advantage over someone who received less instruction in math. And concepts are easier to interpret if you come from a background with a richer vocabulary. Students from poorer or less educated backgrounds are automatically at a disadvantage.
And how did they interpret the results of the IQ test?
The results were not seen as the outcome of training, but rather as something that was just a part of someone's personality. They claimed that students with immigrant backgrounds and those who simply come from poorer backgrounds are less intelligent. IQ tests were used to justify the idea that there is a more intelligent class of people. Eugenicists then demanded that the poor people be sterilized.
That's brutal.
The flaw in IQ tests is that they pretend to test a blank slate, as if intelligence were a quantity that exists independently of any context. But what they actually measure is the extent to which someone has been trained in mathematics and logic up to that point. Those who score well will also have better career opportunities later on. But that's probably not so much due to their inherent personality as to the training they have received up to that point.
To put it simply, an IQ test is a lot like any other exam you might take in school.
Good grades aren't necessarily a proof of intelligence. There are people we consider intelligent who were poor students, such as Albert Einstein.
Didn't he had an IQ of 160?
Einstein never took an IQ test. Studies have also found that the motivation to do well on the test have a significant impact on the result.
Motivation is important too.
It's no surprise that motivated people tend to be more successful later in life, but motivation and intelligence are not the same. Furthermore, IQ tests measure how well someone can handle a time limit.
If you're a quick thinker, that's not a disadvantage.
The time limit is more of an indicator of how well someone can handle stress. Also, people who are more self-confident will have fewer problems with time limits.
These are traits that are more related to personality than to intelligence.
The biggest illusion about IQ tests is the seemingly accurate result, which are specific numbers like 92, 114 or 123. This creates the false impression that intelligence can be measured just like the weight or speed of an object. In this way, an IQ test appears scientific, but it's just an illusion of precision. There are too many factors unrelated to intelligence that influence the result, like one's social background or motivation.
And what about social intelligence?
IQ tests only ask questions that can ultimately be evaluated with a number, usually a 0 or a 1, meaning right or wrong. IQ tests don't include questions that need complex answers. Yet, these are precisely the kinds of questions that would be useful for determining intelligence.
Intelligence can take many forms.
To generalize IQ test results, Spearman's G factor is used. Someone who performed well on one test should perform well on others. And indeed, someone who is motivated to take one test will be motivated for others as well. However, there are such large deviations that the actual number obtained from a test is essentially worthless.
So perhaps intelligence is not innate after all.
In the long run, IQ tests showed the opposite. James Flynn proved that IQ test results increased throughout the 20th century in the overall population. This would not be possible if intelligence were simply innate. A more convincing explanation for the rise is better education. This was called the Flynn effect.
This proves that eugenics starts from the wrong premises.
There are many critics of the IQ tests, but the tests are still around today. The test results aren't completely wrong, but they aren't as precise as they claim to be. IQ tests is a far cry from the scientific precision you find in the natural sciences. So, don't let the number fool you.
If you have any thoughts on this, please share them in the comments. Subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.